All right, good morning, everybody. Everybody, it's a small group, but good morning. Thank you for waking up and joining us this morning. Welcome to our panel, which is going to touch on romance and sex through the ages. I am Michelle Beattie. To my left is Alyssa Palmer. Alyssa is a Canadian writer and freelance editor. She splits her time between a full-time day job and her part-time loves, which are writing and editing. Her novella, Prohibited Passion, and short story, Betting the Farm, are available as ebooks. Her short story, V, will be available in the upcoming charity anthology, Felt Tips, in December 2012. She's currently working on 2 new projects, one of which is a novel set during the gangster heyday in Chicago in 1925. Past Alyssa is Jade Buchanan. Jade's writing is as eclectic as her reading tastes, with over 30 erotic romance tales currently published. She's been known to accept writing challenges from friends and family just to see their reactions. And Jade is also a firm believer that love and romance are universal concepts, no matter a person's gender, identity, or sexual orientation. Originally from Northern Ontario, she's lived in British Columbia and in the Sultanate of Oman in the Middle East. Jade currently lives in Calgary, Alberta, where she's hard at work on her next story. On the end, we're pleased to have Kelley Armstrong. Kelley has been telling stories since before she could write. Her earliest written efforts were disastrous. If asked for a story about girls and dolls, hers would invariably feature undead girls and evil dolls, much to her teacher's dismay. Today, she continues to spin tales of ghosts and demons and werewolves while safely locked away in her basement writing dungeon. She lives in southwestern Ontario with her husband, kids, and far too many pets. As I mentioned before, my name is Michelle Beattie. It took me 12 years and 4 completed manuscripts before I sold my first book, A Historical Pirate Adventure, off the slush pile to Berkeley Publishing. Since then, I've sold 2 more to Berkeley, and I've self-published 3, 2 historical westerns and 1 contemporary. Why pirates? 2 words, Johnny Depp. I like to write whatever pulls at my heart, demanding to be told, and so that's the reason for my multiple genres. So we are being recorded, I've been told, so we'll try to talk into the microphones, and we'll have some questions here. We'll go through how we've seen things change, and then at the end we'll open it up to questions. So just quickly, the definition of a romance novel on Wikipedia. The romance novel is a literary genre developed in Western culture, mainly in English-speaking countries. Novels in this genre place their primary focus on the relationship and romantic love between 2 people and must have an emotionally satisfying and optimistic ending. Through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, these novels are commercially in 2 main varieties: category romances, which are shorter books with a 1-month shelf life, and single-title romances, which are generally longer with a longer shelf life. One of the earliest romance novels was Samuel Richardson's popular 1740 novel Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, which was revolutionary on 2 counts. It focused almost entirely on courtship and did so entirely from the perspective of a female protagonist. In the next century, Jane Austen expanded the genre, and her Pride and Prejudice is often considered the epitome of the genre. Austen inspired Georgette Heyer, who introduced historical romances in 1921. A decade later, British company Mills & Boon began releasing the first category romance novels. It is often claimed that the modern romance genre was born in 1972 with Avon's publication of Kathleen Woodiwise's The Flame and the Flower, which Alyssa brought. The first single-title romance novel to be published as an original paperback in the U.S., though in the UK romance was long established through the works of Georgette Heyer, Catherine Cookson, and others. The genre boomed in the 80s with the addition of many category romance lines and an increased number of single-title romances. Popular authors began pushing the boundaries of the genre, and plots and characters began to modernize. In North America, romance novels are the most popular genre in modern literature, and romance novels appear in 90 languages. So we've come a long way. So going with this definition then, as we start our questions, Alyssa, how have you seen romance novels evolve over the years?
Well, probably for me, the first one I ever... Oh, is it turned on?
Well.
Okay, I'll speak into the mic. The first one I ever read was The Flame and the Flower. I'm pretty sure when my mother recommended it, she didn't realize totally what the content was. Because, as Michelle noticed in the definitions of romance, romance has really progressed. A lot of the really old bodice rippers, Flame in the Flower, like the old Rosemary Rogers. Is it?
We're not hearing it. Just want to make sure it's on.
Testing?
There you go.
There you go.
Oh, hello.
Here, real close.
So, Flame in the Flower and books by Rosemary Rogers, basically it was sort of a forced seduction because women couldn't enjoy sexual pleasure. And I'm glad to see now that we've kind of gone beyond that, because it's a little uncomfortable when they're being raped on page 34. So I probably started with this, and then I went on to other old historical romance novels, the Georgette Hare, and I read a lot of the classics. So, I don't know. I can't think of anything else right now.
How about you, Jade? What have you seen?
Well, I actually used to read some of those old Mills and Boons, the Betty Neal's books, and the one thing that you see in a lot of those, and I think it's a generational thing, because they're contemporary books that are written in that time, a lot of the women in those novels, the categories, they were either a nurse, a teacher, a nanny, or they were some, maybe a secretary or something like that. So that's one thing that I love, that we don't necessarily have to stick to those occupations anymore. But one of the things that I find the most positive about the evolution of the romance is seeing how it's been integrated into other genres. A lot of urban fantasies these days have, like the Patricia Briggs, Ilona Anders, even Kelley does. They've brought romance into some of the other genres so that it may not necessarily be the most important thing throughout the entire story, but it's an element of the story. So all the cross-genre writing that you don't necessarily have, this is a romance, this is a science fiction, this is a fantasy. You have this cross-genre appeal, which I think is a really positive thing that's been happening in the last couple decades that you wouldn't necessarily have seen when those original romance novels were written, that romance was separate and it was something that only women could enjoy or only women of a certain kind could enjoy. The other thing that I really think is very positive about the evolution of the romance novel is the inclusion of alternative lifestyles. You see a lot of, even the definition of the romance novel is between two people with a optimistic ending. You have a lot of series out there that are more happily for now rather than happily ever after. So it brings in a little bit more realism into it, that they have to fight for it instead of just being, that when you pick up a certain novel that they're going to end up together at the end of it. So it kind of takes some of that mystery out of it. But I read a lot of gay romance, and you wouldn't have seen that, especially the romance part of it. There were a lot of people that were writing in the 1970s were writing gay erotica, but you knew when you were reading those books that there was no romance. They were not going to end a happily ever after. Even some of the gay romance that go into historical times, just because of the timing, again, it's not going to be a happy story. And you see that now, there's a lot of genres where the gay romance is the focus of it. There's a lot of people that in mainstream writing that will put in secondary characters that are gay. That is something that you wouldn't have necessarily seen, 30 years ago. And I think I'll end there for now.
So yeah, I started reading romance too young, of course. My grandmother read them, and she would give them by the bag load to my mother, who didn't read them, which then meant that she wasn't reading them and seeing whether they were appropriate for me, only that I was reading above my age level, so maybe I would enjoy them. I did learn at a very early age, and my love was historicals. I learned at a very early age to have this little trick where I would flip forward to the first sex scene. And if it was not mutual sex, I didn't read the book, which meant that I had to skip a whole lot of the historicals at that time. The so-called forced seduction, we now call that rape, was so predominant that I just learned flip forward. Is she saying yes? Is she saying no, 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 and then, just happens to enjoy it? Put that one aside. So we are, thank God, seeing a whole lot less of that. I can read a historicals, and it's extremely rare for me to come across that, which I love, because that is the genre that I really do enjoy reading. And we have seen it progress in other ways too, as you've heard. And a lot of it has to do with the way the women are portrayed. We are not getting as many of the boss secretary stories, although apparently there's still a huge market for them, 50 Shades of Grey. But in general, we don't get nearly as much of that. We do see a much more modern woman in a lot of the romance, and seeing modern lifestyles, whether it is sexual orientation or the long-term choices that the couple makes. It doesn't necessarily have to end in marriage and babies, and that has been really good to see, better reflecting the society that we have, and better reflecting women's sexuality, because we no longer have to do the no, 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 oh, that was actually fun. No, we can have women who are interested in and enjoy sex, and that is just now a normal part of romance, and I'm very happy to see that.
Yeah, I'm with Kelley on that. I think the heroines especially are more relatable to the readers because, A, we're smarter. We're lots more educated than we were back then, too. It's nice really, there's not that many of us that are still virgins on our wedding day, much as we'd like to pretend. So it's nice. For me, I like that. I find I can relate to them. Women are stronger, which for me I really love because I write strong women. I always hated the books where she's mad till he touches her and then she forgets, and I'm like, not in my world, man. I didn't start reading romances till I was 19, so I kind of started in the 80s. And already they were, I think, different than what Alyssa would have started with. Stronger women we can relate to, professions we've done or professions we'd want to do. I think, or those earlier romances, I don't know how many women would have thought to themselves, oh, I'd love to have been that woman. And now you get these women that are like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or, they're strong and they're tough and they're savvy. And I think as a reader, it's fun to read them because you're like, oh, I want to do that, right? I want to be that kick-ass kind of girl. One of the biggest changes I saw in a really cool book was Nora Roberts, her tribute book. You have a heroine who flips houses, and she's out there wielding this sledgehammer with her boots, and the hero is a comic book writer. But she could have totally made him wimpy, and he wasn't. And what I liked about it was he made, not a joke, but he was so comfortable with his skin, that he didn't have a problem with the fact that he flat out said, I can't lift that hammer, like, good for you. And so, again, you would have never seen that, 50 years ago. It would have been like, ooh, he's not manly. And yet he really was, and she was awesome. Who doesn't want to be a heroine who can hammer down a wall, so... So Jade and Kelley both touched on how the books are getting, 50 Shades is a very good example. It's a very sexual book. So we're definitely seeing increasingly sexual books in all the genres, including young adult. Has this affected your writing? Do you enjoy having that freedom that you maybe wouldn't have had we been writing 30, 40 years ago? Alyssa?
Well... 30 or 40 years ago, I wouldn't have been writing anyway, but...
Yeah, rub that in, thank you.
Oops. But certainly, I appreciate the ability to write the stories that I want to write and not have to worry about how explicit it is. I tend to write more of a sensual romance, but I have a lot of gay characters in my books as well, and so I don't have to worry about someone freaking out and thinking that's really bad. So definitely... that helps. Though I didn't enjoy 50 Shades while I read it, aside from laughing. I'm glad. Well, it is, but I was hoping for a little more, I think. But what I really appreciate is that erotica and, sort of BDSM erotic romance has become more mainstream, and I'm hoping that a lot of people that read 50 Shades will pick up some of the other books of the genre. And then hopefully we'll get a few more readers.
Well, I don't write sensual books. I write very explicit books, and I like that. I think the last time I counted, there was something like 150 some sex scenes that I'd written. The one thing that I know, I've been reading ebooks since, like 2001, and back then it was the Alora's Cave age, when mainstream New York wasn't necessarily accepting erotica, I shouldn't even say erotica. It's erotic romance, because it's in erotic romance it's a development of a romantic relationship through the sexual orientation. So you don't just have sex for sex's sake. The sex has to be integral to the character development, to the plot, to the relationship. And if it's not, then it really is just sex because you want to titillate. But back then, when you had the people like Laura Lee and Angela Knight and Mary Janice Davidson, Cheyenne McCrae, they all got picked up by New York when the Berkeleys and the Avons and the Kensingtons realized how popular this genre was. Then that was the first wave of the erotic romance being accepted in New York. You're now seeing the second wave of it with the 50 Shades of Grey, bringing attention again to the genre, expanding it past the romance reader, that now people who wouldn't necessarily have picked up a romance are picking up this book because it's been marketed brilliantly. The cover is non-threatening. It's got the Oprah effect because it was, it was on all over the media, and so people are picking this up and they're realizing that there are more things out there than they may have realized, which is, I guess, kind of cool. But I like the freedom of being sexually explicit because it gives you the opportunity to explore a different type of relationship. And I mean, I think anytime that you have a variety of romances out there, from the very sweet closed door romances where there's maybe a few kisses, to anything that's completely not closed door at all. It gives the reader the freedom and the opportunity to be able to go through those options and pick what they like, and it puts the onus back on the reader to be able to discover for themselves, and I think that's a really good thing for the entire romance genre, really.
When Bitten came out in 2001, the sex in that was considered risque for the times. It was considered explicit. By today's standards, definitely not. It is fairly tame for urban fantasy, definitely tame for some paranormal romance. The standards have certainly evolved, and we are allowed to do pretty much anything. I mean, yes, 50 Shades of Grey. People who think that is out there and risque have not been reading romance or urban fantasy, because it is as tame as Bitten was. It really is. But we do have the freedom now to do pretty much anything, which is wonderful. The flip side, though, is the pressure to add sex to books. My series, because it changed narrators, the level of sexual explicitness changed. Because to me, what the character would do or what the character would reveal changed with the character. So if I'm doing werewolves, yes, definitely. If I'm doing a more closed-off character, that door closes much sooner. That is how I write it. But there is an expectation that once you have established a standard, you will maintain that standard, and that if you are not at the industry standard, you should be there. I know Patricia Briggs was mentioned. She gets a lot of flack for closing the door. Yeah. She really does. I jokingly offered to, write in the sex scenes for her. But she does get a lot for that. And I just feel no author should. Yeah. I mean, I do get that. I get I enjoyed the book, but how come there wasn't very much sex? And I'm like, there are plenty of books out there if that's what you're looking for. It doesn't happen to be a guarantee of what I'm delivering. So there's sometimes editorial pressure. I did have one editor who kept reminding me, sex sells. And I'm like, that's nice. And I wouldn't change a thing. But yeah, so I love the freedom to do it. Don't love the pressure to do it. Speaking of YA, I know several authors who write fairly explicit work who have done YA or are strongly considering YA for exactly that reason. They are so freaking sick of having to write X number of sex scenes in a book. And they're like, YA, no sex. And I'm like, that's not a good reason to write YA. Let's write a different adult series that just has a different level or standard of sex in it. But yes, it can be that much pressure that you would completely change genres just to never have to write another sex scene.
Yeah, I actually agree with that, because I know with me, because I do write erotic romance, that it's very character dependent. Not every character is going to want to, in the first chapter, they just meet somebody and want to have sex right away. And I know I've gotten a lot of flack from my publishers that I'll turn in a book and I'll think it's really great, and then the first edit, I'll get back, well, you need to add 3 more sex scenes. And I'm like, I don't know where I'm going to add them, because there's just, when you start quantifying it like that, or saying that you need to have a certain level of explicitness, then I don't know if that's really, it's not really fair. But it also kind of does a disservice to the readers, because now you're putting in things just because it's expected, and it may not necessarily fit who the characters are or what the book is. I know one of my favorite scenes of yours is in No Humans Allowed on the balcony scene, and I thought that was just, and it's not even really explicit, but it's just a really cool scene to show how they fit together, and it's not something that should just be forced.
Well, I think that depends on who you're publishing with, too, because a lot of the Harlequin category lines have specific numbers of sex scenes. I think Blaze is 2 or 3, and then it depends on the other ones. I think Christian Inspirational, you don't get any.
Yeah.
I don't even think you get Closed Door, but, don't quote me.
I think you get in trouble if you put them in those.
Possibly, yes. But definitely, they're more particular.
And I think, to add to that, for sure, if you have an editor and you're with a publishing house, of course, you still have artistic license, but if you have to, and if you're targeting a certain line, then do your research and know what they want, know what they're publishing. Don't send a Christian market book with 3 sex scenes in it, obviously, because they don't do that. Actually, we have a lady in our group who's got 30-some books published with Harlequin Steeple Hill, and she wrote a book where literally her heroine I'm not sure. They might have actually been married. But she straightened his tie, and they made her take it out. Yeah, so the market.
Is that a euphemism for something else, though?
No. I don't know. He was going to an event, and she had to straighten his tie, and they said, no, too sexual, take it out. So know your market. Obviously, right? For me, I think it's having the 50 Shades in some of those books. I'm not going to say it's going to hurt me, but I have no problems writing one explicit scene. That's what I'm comfortable with. And I've been told by the 75-year-old ladies in my little community that I don't write enough smut. So, but I'm not comfortable with that. And I don't get that graphic. There's certain words. Well, I write historicals for the most part, so it's okay. There's certain words. But on my contemporary, when they had sex, there's words I can't even put my fingers on those keys. So, but I'm going to write what's true to me, and because I think it'll show if you're forcing it. It'll show if you're padding it. Don't add it, 50 Shades is great, I'm going to put 8 sex scenes in here. Like Jade said, it's got to go with your characters. It's got to go with your story. And be true to both of those, and be true to yourself as a writer. All right. So the challenges and benefits to writing in different time periods, or doing different time periods, because obviously writing a contemporary is different than writing a historical. There's the research, obviously, but there's other aspects that make, if you're writing a time travel or a historical, or even steampunk, because some of that obviously takes place in the past. So Alyssa, because you also write historicals, challenges and benefits to writing in different time periods or using different time periods.
Well, let's go with benefits first, I guess. I like to be able to wish I lived somewhere else and in a different time, and so that gives me a chance to explore it, but it can be hard to get little facts right, and especially writing historical, I like to go back and research what's happened in the society at the time and what is taboo and what isn't. So in writing, particularly lesbian romance, it's definitely taboo once you kind of go back past 40 years or so, and so I have to take that into account when I'm writing because I want it to feel realistic. And if they're having a big open relationship that everyone knows about, well, I can't see that happening in 1920.
So that was a challenge. What about the benefit? Oh, that was the benefit you said, right?
Well, that was sort of both.
Okay.
And I think in terms of being a reader of historicals, I tend to be a little neurotic about details, and so if there's something that isn't historically accurate, if I notice it, I tend to be pulled out of the story. But I think that maybe is just me.
No.
It's not. Jade?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I don't write historicals, because I overdose on research, and it can be a good thing sometimes, but I have a feeling if I ever wrote a historical, I would probably have all this really horrible historical detail in there, and then I'd probably still get it wrong. But, I mean, historical accuracy to me is really important, and I know there's a lot of people that write gay historicals that I never could do that, because to me, like, just the idea of putting them in those time periods, like you said, you can't be open, so you can't really have well, I mean, it's not like everybody can be open even in today's society, so that also plays into the contemporary romance, but yeah, I don't know if I'd be able to do that. I love writing contemporaries because I mean, you're able to draw from the people around you, from your own experiences, from the things that are going on. But again, I feel sometimes you can be almost constricted by some of the rules. Add a dash of paranormal into that, and now you can start creating your own rules, so you don't necessarily have to get all of the little nitty-gritty details accurate. As long as you make your own rules and then you follow your own rules, people aren't going to be picking you apart for that. But futuristics, I think, are really fun to play with. And I know there's a lot of sci-fi fantasy that go into that. I actually have a friend of mine who wrote. She loves Regencies. That's all she that's all she reads pretty much. But she writes gay romance, so she didn't really want to set a romance between two men in a Regency period because of the fact that it wouldn't necessarily be a really open relationship, and I mean, like, you could be killed if you get caught. So she actually took the whole Regency period and put it into space, into a futuristic time frame, and had the same kind of rules with the courtship, and that if you get caught with somebody, that you have to get married, and it was brilliant. I just thought she did a beautiful job of taking some of those things that she liked about the historical period, but completely changing it around so that she can make it unique.
Yeah, and as much as I love reading historical, I don't write it. And that is because I just feel it would take so much to get it right, and I really would feel that extreme need to get every last detail, every last word, was that correct for the period. So you were mentioning futuristics. The other way to take that historical and do it is obviously epic high fantasy. Mm-hmm. So I've written, I just finished a YA that is epic fantasy, and that, in that sense, you are able to then take a historical period and use it. I was using Japanese imperialism, and taking that, and yet you don't have to worry about being 100% accurate, and you can pull in from other times, other cultures, while still maintaining that historical feel for it.
I think part of it, if you're going to do historical, you'd better like researching and better like hanging out in library archives and looking at dusty old maps and stuff. and primary sources, which I actually love to do, and I think I miss my calling, and I should have taken library archivist training. But if you are going to do historical, maybe try it and focus it on one very specific time period and see if you can get primary sources and secondary sources and look at old newspapers and stuff, and then just create from there. And of course there's the old disclaimer, any mistakes I made are my own and not, the fault of the people that are helping me or the material that I read.
I mean, the other way you can do it is, I know it's something that Kelley's done, where if you like some of the historical pieces, I mean, if you have a vampire that, I know you do that with Cassandra, where you bring in some instances, of her previous lifetimes, bring in some of that historical detail, and I think that's one way of bringing it in without necessarily getting really bogged down in like the entire world.
Yes, very, very briefly, briefly. One chapter, and that still takes me forever to research every last detail, which then tells me why I would never be good to write a historical novel.
All right. So just kind of wrap. We'll just go through one more time and just kind of say what in general how we've kind of seen things change. For me, the biggest thing is I like that you really can do anything you want. Like but the mentality, like we're still fighting as a romance genre. We're still fighting that the bodice ripper stigma. People still think it's just boy meets girl, they break up, they get back together. We're so much more than that, and just us four sitting here, we've done like 1920 gangsters, we've done gay erotica, we've done paranormal, urban fantasy, we've done historical pirates. Like this proves you can really do anything in romance, and it's smart and it's savvy, and it's whatever you want it to be. Just do your research if you're writing historicals, and create a really believable world if you're going the urban, the fantasy route, and be true to your characters. And I mean, obviously, my pirates aren't going to send a fax. Although in my Western, I did have that. My critique group caught it because I'm like, hey, she answered back a telegraph. And he said, if you need anything else, give me a call. I totally missed it. So I mean, it happens. Get beta readers. But for me, it's different. It's just romance has come such a long way. We've come from where women were voiceless, where women had no spine, to where women can be the main hero of a book or a TV series or whatever. Because really, romance isn't just in books, and I like that. I like that it represents the spectrum of life more than it used to, and we can create worlds and hopefully take you away. And so if you haven't read a romance, I hope you give one a shot, because they really have come a long way.
Actually, I have a question for you, Michelle. How much research do you do when you do your pirate books?
Damn it.
No pressure.
I'm a lazy researcher. There, I put it out there. I researched my ships very, very well. And I researched the golden age of piracy, because to me, if I was going to write a pirate book, I was putting it in the Caribbean. I wasn't putting it in London, but that's what I wanted. I've never been to the Caribbean. So and honestly, I don't keep track of my websites. I research as I need. I'm not one of these, not the ship. The ship I had to research before I wrote the book, because I needed to know how it was going to work. But clothes-wise, word-wise, I have a really great dictionary called English Through the Ages. And it not only tells you when the word was invented, it'll tell you when it changed its meaning, because it will have changed its meaning. They don't all stay the same meaning over the years. So that's my Bible. I do live with that. As far as the sex and stuff part of it, I don't believe we invented sex. I believe there was sex before marriage. All of that happened. The stuff we do now, it all happened back then. It might not have been open. It might not have been everything people knew about, but there was people getting pregnant out of before marriage, and there was people doing weird positions way back then. So I don't worry about that sort of stuff. What they do in the bedroom is their business. I mean, obviously, there's no birth control pill or whatever. So I research as I go. I have been told I have a bit of a contemporary voice in a historical setting. I'm okay with that, because I don't like reading books that are so deep in history and so deep in how they talk, the dialect, that I can't understand them. So my readers seem to like that. I've never been called out on shoddy research, so I might have been lazy, but I think I did it okay. So, but it is a lot of work. And when I did write my one contemporary, I did have to research bear poaching and park wardens, but it's way easier because you don't have to research when was this word created and would they have had, how would they have gotten, the hardest part was how many days would it take for them to get from Tortuga to Port Royal and figuring out the ships and so you don't have to do that. You know, Edmonton to Jasper's 3 hours by car. It's easier to write a contemporary. I will definitely do more, but... answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
All right.
Actually, and it brought up something else. I know we were talking about sexual explicitness earlier. If you're going to write something that's really, really sexual, you might want to research something about that as well, because there's nothing worse than, as a reader, going through a book, and I'm sure you all realize this, going through a book and then kind of tilting your head to the side and saying, I don't think that's physically possible, or I'm pretty sure they wouldn't be feeling that. I'm sure there would be some pain if you did that without preparation. So, I mean, it's something that, you know, as much as a lot of people, you know, blush and giggle when they talk about it or when they write it, you really do have to kind of get bare bones. And
Jade has props for this.
I do.
Tell us all about them.
And you have yet to bring them to show us all.
I never bring them to show people. It gives them the completely wrong impression of me. I am a sweet and innocent person. I really am. I don't know why everyone giggles when I say that. I have about 15 G.I. Joes, Barbies, Ken dolls. I even have a Beauty and the Beast doll, the Beast. He's really cute. But what I do is when I first started writing, especially when you're writing like gay romance, it's not like I can get two of my friends and kind of set them up and say, okay, where would your hand be? So what I would do is I'd set up the G.I. Joes or the Barbies and really just kind of leave them there like artist models to try to get placement and things. And then sometimes I forget that I've left them out, and if people come over to my house and they get little... But, and then I started taking pictures because I felt it was cruel to leave them in positions and not go back for them afterwards. So I would take pictures, and then I'd mail them and email them to my friends, and then it just kind of went viral, and a lot of people have seen them, and now I have no hope of ever trying to say that I'm innocent again. But it really does help, especially, like, we talked about, like, romance as being two people. I write a lot of menage, threesomes, foursomes, moresomes, that when you get a lot of individuals in a scene together,
you coordinate
you really
them all.
do.
Where are they all those hands?
You've got hands everywhere, you know, or knees, and so that's why when I'm reading a book, or if I, you know, like when you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, well, I think that would be really uncomfortable for the individual. They should probably see a chiropractor afterwards because they didn't stretch at all before that. So yeah, it goes to the research that you need to do something that helps you or aids you in making it accurate. Because, I mean, when you're writing sex into a book, it's just as important, in my opinion, as making sure that the ship that you're using is the right ship, or making sure that if you have a rule for how your vampires are going to act in your story, that you're consistent. If you say that your vampires burn up in the sun, that you don't have them sitting outside under, you know, an awning at the middle of lunchtime, or if you're going to have gangsters in your novels that, lesbian gangsters in your novels that they're not like walking down the street kissing each other. I mean, it's just as important, any part of your story, that you get it, that you treat it right. Yeah, I'm innocent.
So do your research in person if possible.
And really, if you're married, I'm sure your partner would probably be happy to help you with that.
Although they need to then tell people, yes, I help her with her research.
I tell my husband that all the time, just smile and nod and say you're the research assistant. I did use him once, though. I had not a battle scene, but the hero and heroine were fighting on the pirate ship, and she had a knife, and she kept trying to get at him, and I didn't have G.I. Joes. I couldn't figure this out. My husband came home for lunch. I said, Brian, I need you to do this. And I said, you'd have your hand here and I'd have my hand here. And if I went to knee you, what would you do? And he just lifted me off the ground and he threw me on the bed. And I would have never thought of that, but I had to hang on to him or else I would have fallen. So it totally disabled me or disarmed me. And then we were on the bed, and I'm like, thank you, I got it. You can go now. What? No. We're just starting. When I was at Romance Writers of America last year, Deanne Gist writes historical romance, and she was beautiful. She came she started off in a shift, and she literally layer by layer put on the hoop, put on the skirt, put on the chemise, put on everything layer by layer. And when she got to the corset, someone said to her, could a guy put his hand down, if he were in the carriage together, could he? And so she's doing that. But it was really cool because I would have never thought, I would have assumed probably. And she's like, well, not really. It's kind of tight. So if you can get G.I. Joes or props or a husband or a friend, it's amazing how what you think might work doesn't. It doesn't. So anyhow, any other last thoughts before we open this up for questions? So if anyone has questions, we have chocolate as bribes.
We'll throw it at you.
And I'll just repeat the questions as they're asked because we are being taped. Yes, Jill? The question is, do we think happy for now is going to be is going to become more acceptable? Because in some genres, it doesn't have to be happy ever after. The book can end with happy for now. I think we're seeing that. I think definitely in women's fiction, that's obviously the way to go. I don't read urban fantasy as a rule, so I can't touch on that. But I've seen other, the romance, they don't always end with the marriage proposal. Not as concrete. I think from the books I've read in romance, they still end, for the most part, with that concrete, we are going to be together forever. How about?
I would say there's way more flexibility now than there was, and personally, as someone, I like to consider my books more noir with some romantic twists. And for me, I might do a happily for now, but really it's sort of happy if you squint and tilt your head. So I like having that flexibility.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of flexibility. I mean, you see it in a lot of the cross-genre books, where if there are series that the happy for now definitely. There's a lot of I know urban fantasy books where the author kills off the romantic interest and annoys a lot of people, and then excites a lot of other people. There's a lot more flexibility. I know in erotic romance, you see a lot of happy for nows. In alternative relationships where you might have like a threesome that ends up as a twosome, or various other types of relationships. I think if you're writing like the mainstream romance, for any of the big New York publishers, the Avons, the Berkeleys, the Harlequins, those are still happily ever afters. They don't necessarily have to have the same complete marriage and baby at the end of it, but I think there has to be some kind of understanding in those types of romances that they are going to end up, and they're probably going to be together forever with hearts coming out of their heads and that kind of thing.
Yes, urban fantasy definitely does allow you to do a happily enough for now ending, which is what I've done a lot. I tend to see my happily ever after is a committed couple, and not necessarily the traditional. So I do change narrators. So I've got my one couple had kids planned before they got married. Second couple have been married for a while now, have no plan to have kids. Third couple have maintained their separate residences, but basically spend their time at one or the other. Fourth couple, late 40s, early 50s, they have been together for years, but have never lived together, and basically meet up when they can. And then I've got my next couple, got married and had a baby in quite quick succession. In urban fantasy, all of those are acceptable because that is what we see in real life. However, there is certainly that contingent of readers, often the ones who come from romance and are just sort of branching out into urban fantasy, who will say, "What do you mean they had kids before they got married? How come aren't these two people happy? Why aren't they living together? Why aren't they getting married? Or this couple here, but they'd make such good parents. When are they going to have babies? And trying to explain that meeting, marrying, having babies does not necessarily mean happily ever after for every couple can be difficult, because they would like to see that certain set of events happening in the proper sequence, and if it does not, they don't consider it a good relationship.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jill. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering how much of a place mainstream romance has these days. I sort of see two ends of the continuum, the explosion in alternative lifestyles, practices, and then the other end of the continuum, the explosion in the popularity of Christian romance. So any thoughts about that?
Okay, so the question was more mainstream contemporary, basic straight contemporary romance, if there's still a place for it. I hope so, because that's what I do. I don't necessarily do contemporary. I mean, obviously I do historicals, but that's what I do. I do I'm still old school, I guess. I still do I don't have, it's still a romance, right? And I know for my editor, when she bought me at Berkeley, one of the things she said was she liked that. She liked that while obviously, like Jade had said earlier, it's really nice to have the gamut of stories, because readers are going to like everything. Right, I myself prefer that, just a romance. I don't always want to read about, other fictitious. I like the real world. Well, I mean, the pirate, it's historical, but still a real world. So I hope there's still a market for it, and I think there will be. I mean, there's always going to be the waves, right? Like, and I think there's enough readers, and this was talked on another panel, but one of the benefits of having the self-publishing revolution coming up or whatever, where you have that, if the big publishers don't want it, like I was told no one likes historical westerns. I couldn't sell my historical western to a big publisher, and yet on Amazon it's doing really well. So I do think there's always going to be a certain amount of readers. Now, are you going to be a bestseller if it's a smaller niche? Maybe not. But I do think there's always going to be the people who want Christian, and the people who want urban fantasy, the people who want BDSM, the people who want noirs and the historicals, and I think I don't write for the market. I never have. I write what pops in my head, the characters that pull to me, and that's true to me, and I'm not making a lot of money off of it, so maybe that wasn't the right way to go. But that's what works for me. That's what feels right for me. So, but I think there's always going to be a market for all of them, because we're all so different and we all have our own tastes in what we like to read. But
well, and romance is the best-selling genre still, and there's a lot of contemporary romance that are just romances that are doing really well. Jennifer Probst's The Marriage Bargain, which has been on the New York Times list, it's a contemporary romance, and I would say it's pretty traditional.
And Nora Roberts, really too. Well. Like, she just keeps... I mean, her name carries her, too, but she writes really good books, and they're straight contemporaries, a lot of them. She's dabbled with some paranormal elements. But, like, her latest, The Bride Quartet, there's a wee bit of a ghost, but that's really not what the story's about. Or not the Innsbruck trilogy, but... So...
Well, and I think the reason why you see the big explosion of the Christian romance and the erotic romance are because they're new. It's something that you wouldn't necessarily have seen as much of, 20 years ago, when it was just, this is what a romance is. And now you're seeing that expanding. You're also seeing a bit of a backlash against that in some places. A lot of the erotic romance lines that New York put out ended up closing or ended up folding back into each other. So I think there's enough room out there for everything. And romance has always been a wave. Pirate books were huge in the 80s, and they're making a bit of a comeback now. I mean, there's always going to be a bit of a wave between what people like. So I don't see the death of the mainstream contemporary romance anytime soon.
Yeah, and yes, the way that you make your needs heard is buy those books. You buy the books that you want to see more of, and share them. Get more people reading them, because as long as there are people buying and reading them, there will continue to be a market for them.
Kim, did you still have a question?
Actually, you touched on it, Michelle, regarding the indie publishing. I was just wondering if any of you who are traditionally published or published from e-publishers are starting to notice a difference in some of their criteria because of the freedom that the indie market is bringing. Like, for instance, maybe I don't want to put 3 sex scenes in this book, so I love this book this way. I'm going to indie pub it instead of bringing it to you. Do you feel that they're getting any of that kind of pressure? They're starting to change some of the criteria at all?
That the publishers are changing the criteria, you mean? So. Okay, so the question was, are the publishers starting to open up a little bit more and giving the authors a little more freedom, because the authors now have the option of, if they don't really want to change the book, they can self-publish the book. Jade?
No.
No, yeah.
No.
No, the thing is that the people who are their best-selling authors are not interested in going elsewhere.
Yeah.
The majority of us we like our publishers. We know which side our bread is buttered on. And the people that I do hear saying, if my publisher won't take this, I'll go EPUB, are the mid-list. Yeah. And the publishers are already squeezing their mid-list. So that doesn't put any pressure on them. It would only be if the big names did, and the big names are not going to, because they already have. I mean, nobody is going to tell a big-name author, you must have 6 sex scenes. What they say is, we would like you to have more, and you say, that's nice, and write what you want, because if you're pulling in enough profit for them, they are not going to tell you what to write.
I mean, I think the advent of the self-publishing and e-publishing has been really, really good for the mid-list author, like Kelley was saying. And I think it's given them more freedom, number one, to publish their backlist if they're traditionally published, or for some people that may have been electronically published, it gives them a different avenue to write what they want to write that their publisher may be telling them. But as far as pressure on the publishers themselves, not yet. Because, I mean, as long as the people that are making like a ton of money are still really making the decisions at some of those publishers, they're not going to be changing, which is okay.
So we've got people lined up at the door, so we're going to call this a day. But thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you to Kelley and Jade and Alyssa for joining me, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.